You know, when you come home, the war doesn't always stay behind. It has a way of following you back. You know, it comes into your room at night when you're trying to sleep. You know, it's there in your family dinners. It's in the moments when you're supposed to feel safe. For some of us, it shows up as hypervigilance. You know, every door, every stranger, every sound, it's scanned and assessed for danger. You know, for others, it's nightmares that drag you back into places that you just never want to return to. And sometimes it's guilt. You know, that voice telling you that you should have done more. You should have saved more. You know, you just should have been better.
These are invisible battles. You know, they're battles that we all face, you know, whether we want to admit it or not. And they're often harder to fight than really anything that we face downrange. You know, life doesn't necessarily have to look messy on the outside for those battles to take over. You can have everything in order, rolling along perfectly, life is great, and you can still be carrying something that no one around you can ever really fully understand. You know, PTSD isn't just a combat issue. You know, it's the body and the mind that's stuck in survival mode long after the threat is gone. You know, combat stress rewires the way that you think. You know, it literally changes the way that you think. You know, random noises can feel like danger. Crowded rooms can turn into just anxiety-inducing chaos. You know, even at home, your nervous system just keeps running as if you're still deployed. And, you know, PTSD isn't weakness. It's proof that you've endured something that most people couldn't even imagine. And not everything that haunts you, you know, is necessarily PTSD. There's also something that's not as widely talked about called moral injury. You know, that's the one that's left on your conscience when you see or do things that clash with your values. You know, maybe it was being ordered to do something that you didn't believe in. Maybe it was not being able to save someone. You know, maybe it was just being there when things happened that broke the code that you personally live by. You know, moral injury isn't really about fear. It's more about betrayal and grief and the clash between who you are and what you had to do when you were in the uniform. That's why so many veterans will tell you they're not really haunted by what happened to them, but by what happened through them. You know, and there's the stigma in the military that asking for help, you know, felt like paying a target on your back. You know, it meant that you were weak, that you're broken, you know, that you weren't mission ready. You know, that mindset can easily follow us home. And too many veterans would rather suffer in silence than just admit that they're struggling. You know, but the silence is the real enemy. Because untreated pain doesn't just go away, it just festers. You don't have to fight these battles alone. You know, there are tools, there are resources out there. You know, there's people ready to stand with you. Sometimes the smallest steps can help. You know, grounding techniques can help. They can pull you out of a spiral or a panic attack. You know, there's actual therapy options like EMDR, CBT, and group work. You know, these all have proven results. And just peer support. You know, just talking to another veteran who understands can sometimes be some of the best medicine that you'll ever find. You know, brotherhood doesn't have to end when we take off our uniforms. You know, it just shifts. You know, the support that we had when we were in can still live on if we're just willing to reach out for it. So if you're battling PTSD or any of the other invisible battles, you know, make this your mission for today. Just tell somebody, just one person, you know, whether it's a buddy, a spouse, another veteran, you know, it could be anybody. You know, just break the silence. Take the first step forward. The internal war only grows stronger when it's hidden. But once you drag it into the light, you can put up a fight and you can win. You know, coming home isn't about pretending that your service never happened. You know, it's about learning how to carry it without letting it crush you. No veteran should ever have to fight these battles alone. And if you do hear this, just know that you're part of a tribe still that has your six. Reach out, connect. Don't be afraid to speak up. Silence only isolates us further. Follow along as we keep building this community. You know, let's make it our personal missions to ensure that no more of our brothers or sisters are left behind. You know, we carried each other while we were in the uniform, and we can carry each other now. Stay strong.